An old man pulled a saddlebag from a hollow oak, and his jaw dropped. What he found inside would keep him awake for 3 weeks running and cost him the oldest friendship he had left in this world. But that came later. First, there was the morning, and the fog, and the work that still needed doing. Norris Langford had been marking timber since 1973. He knew Clatsop County's forests the way other men knew their own backyards. Every ridge, every draw, every stand of old growth that the logging companies had somehow missed or left alone because the ground was too steep or the access too poor or the trees too twisted to make the economics work. He was 64 now, and this was his last contract before he signed the retirement papers his wife Helen had been sliding in front of him for the better part of 2 years. Wiki Up Ridge. 40 acres of Douglas fir and Sitka spruce up above the fog line, owned by a timber investment trust out of Portland that had bought the parcel at auction and wanted a selective harvest cruise done before next week's cut crew arrived. He had backed his Chevy Silverado up to the trailhead in the dark, drinking coffee from a thermos, while the radio played something he didn't recognize. Helen had packed him a sandwich and left a note on the bag that said, "Back by 2, the way she had been saying it for 30 years. He folded the note and put it in his shirt pocket without reading past the first word. The coffee was too hot, but he drank it anyway. The Stellar's Jay found him before he reached the first timber marker. It screamed at him from somewhere in the canopy, a sound like a gate hinge that nobody had ever oiled. Norris looked up. He couldn't find the bird, but he talked to it anyway, the way he always did on jobs where he was alone. "I see you," he said. The jay screamed again and moved deeper into the fir. The fog sat heavy in the ravine below the ridgeline, and the light came down gray and even through the canopy. Good light for reading bark and estimating diameter, no shadow to fool your eye about what a tree was actually carrying. His boots pushed through duff that was 6 inches deep in places, 40 years of needle drop and rot, soft and dark as good garden soil, and it smelled of that too, of earth working on itself the way earth does when nobody hurries it along. He moved through the stand methodically, the way he always had, clipboard under his arm, diameter tape looped over his shoulder, can of orange paint in his left hand. He marked a fir near the top of the first draw, 60 inches diameter breast height, clear of epicormic branching up to 60 feet, worth cutting. He marked another beside it, then passed on a third that had a conch bracket at the base indicating heart rot. These were the decisions that took experience to make right. You could train a young man to measure a tree. You couldn't train him to look at the trunk and know what was living inside it. He worked his way up toward the ridgeline through the morning, stopping once to write a note about a blowdown that would complicate skidder access, stopping again to check his compass against the survey map. The fog burned off below him as the sun came up, but stayed put up here, drifting between the big trunks in loose gray rags. He found the oak at 9:47 in the morning. He checked his watch when he saw it, the way he always did, a habit he had kept up for 30 years without examining why. The tree was not part of the harvest. Oaks had no commercial value in this part of Oregon, and this one sat about 30 feet off the survey parcel anyway. But he had known it since his first job on this ridge in 1992. 300 years old at minimum. 7 feet across at breast height, the bark plated in gray and brown and black like armor. A long vertical split on the north side opened into a cavity wide enough to fit a man's arm to the shoulder. Today, the hollow had something in it that was not bark and not rot. He saw it as a dark shape set back against the pale interior wood. He leaned in. His nose caught leather and something underneath the leather, old paper maybe, and the particular damp smell of metal that has been sitting a long time in still air. He reached in with his right arm. His fingers found the shape and closed on it. He pulled. The saddlebag came out hard, like it had been wedged against the wood on purpose, and it was heavier than it looked. Old leather, cracked along the fold lines, the color of a walnut hull. The buckles were green with oxidation, the copper gone to that pale, dead color that copper goes when it has been wet and dry 100 times and nobody has touched it in between. He set the bag on the moss and knelt down beside it. His knees hurt. They had been hurting since his mid-50s, and he had learned to ignore it the way you ignore a sound that never changes. He worked the first buckle. It fought him for half a minute before the pin pulled through the hole, and then the flap came up. Inside, a manila folder, water-stained at the edges, but the paper still holding together. He lifted it out and opened it. 7 pages, photocopied VA disability claim forms, each one typed, each one bearing a different name at the top and a different signature at the bottom. He read the first name and his chest went cold. Beneath the folder, a zippered bank pouch, the kind a branch manager might carry to a night deposit. He unzipped it. Bank statements, First Federal Savings, Astoria Branch. Account name, Dean Suttles. Deposit records running month by month from 1976 through 1984. The amounts were modest, 130 here, 215 there, but they were regular as a heartbeat, and they corresponded in a way Norris could already see even before he did the arithmetic, with what a veteran collecting disability for service-connected injuries would have received in those years. He set the statements down on the moss beside the folder. He reached back into the bag. At the very bottom, underneath everything, there was a small hard object wrapped in a piece of burlap. He unwrapped it. A dog tag on a broken chain. The chain snapped at one of the links, but the tag itself intact. He held it up to the gray light coming through the canopy. The metal was tarnished, almost black. But the stamped letters were sharp. He recognized the dog tag before he read the name. The shape of the numbers, the particular way the letters had been stamped. He recognized it the way you recognize a handshake before you see the face. Poole, Raymond J. Blood type O positive. Methodist. Norris sat down on the moss. His back was against the oak. The clipboard lay beside him on the ground. He did not move for a long time. The jay screamed once more somewhere back in the fir, and then went quiet. And the only sound was the drip of condensation off the canopy, and somewhere far below the ravine, a creek he had never bothered to learn the name of, running the same direction it had always run. Ray Poole had been dead since 1982. He had been Norris's closest friend from their platoon, the man who had pulled him down by the collar during a firefight near Hugh, and probably saved his life. He had come home broken and had never put himself back together. And now his dog tag was inside a hollow oak on a Clatsop County ridgeline. Norris looked at the tag in his palm. He did not speak. There was nothing to say to the fog and the trees that the fog and the trees did not already know. He did not go home. He drove the Chevy down the timber road through the mud and the ruts and turned north at the county road instead of south. And by 10:30, he had parked on the gravel pullout above Young's Bay, where he sometimes stopped to eat lunch when he was working the coastal parcels. From here you could see the bay spread out below in the gray morning light, the water flat and pewter-colored, a single crabbing boat pushing out toward the bar, its wake already gone by the time your eye found it. He had eaten 1,000 lunches in this spot. Today he didn't touch his sandwich. He spread the documents on the bench seat of the truck, the folders and the bank statements and the burlap-wrapped tag. He worked through them the way he worked through a timber survey, methodically, nothing skipped, everything recorded. The Steller's jay had followed him down the mountain, or a different jay had picked him up at the county road. Either way, there was a bird screaming from the alders by the guardrail, and he talked to it the same way he had talked to the other one. "Settle down," he said. "I'm working." 7 VA disability claims, all of them dated between 1975 and 1979. Each one requesting compensation for service-connected injuries from Vietnam service, hearing loss, back injuries from a helicopter crash, shrapnel wounds to the left thigh, combat-related psychological trauma. The forms were photocopies, not originals, but good, clean ones made from a machine that had been in proper working order. The signatures at the bottom of each form were a different matter. Norris had served with 5 of these 7 men. He had known them since '68, had written letters with them from fire bases across Quang Tri Province, had sat next to some of them at reunions every second Saturday at the VFW Hall in Astoria for 30-odd years. He knew their handwriting. Not the way a forensic examiner knows it, with training and instruments, but the way you know a man's walk. You don't analyze it, you just know if something is off. 4 of the 5 signatures he recognized were off. Close, but wrong. The kind of wrong that you only see if you knew the originals. Harlan Pratt had always written with his right hand bent sideways at the wrist, a habit from a first-grade teacher who had tried to cure it and given up, and his capital H tilted slightly left as a result. The H on this form tilted right. Carl Jessup crossed all his lowercase t's in a single sweeping motion left to right that made them look like plus signs. On this form, the crossings were neat and separate, a deliberate pen lift between the vertical and horizontal. Merle Danforth signed his name as a single running motion with a long loop under the F that went almost to the baseline of the line below. This signature had no loop at all. Ray Poole's was the 3rd claim in the stack. Disability compensation for combat-related psychological trauma. He stared at the signature line for a full minute. Ray had been left-handed, a fact that the Army had tried to correct in basic training and failed, and it had given his writing a particular back-slanted quality that was unmistakable on a page. This signature leaned slightly forward. A right-handed imitation. Good, careful, but working from observation, not from inside the hand. Ray had also crossed his capital T's with a downward stroke, almost aggressive, like he was driving a nail. This forger had crossed them flat and neat. He set Ray's form on the seat beside him and picked up the bank statements. He had a pencil stub in his shirt pocket, and he used the back of his clipboard sheet to do the arithmetic. Monthly deposits from April of '76 through December of '84. He added them up column by column. It took him 20 minutes to get through all the statements, and he came out at $241,230. He wrote that number at the bottom of the clipboard sheet and looked at it for a while. Then he wrote it in words. $241,230. He thought about what that number meant to a man trying to hold a marriage together on part-time lumberyard wages when the part of his brain that was supposed to let him sleep had been damaged in a place called Hugh and never properly repaired. Dean Suttles. Norris looked out at the bay for a long time. Dean had volunteered to help with the paperwork. He had said it to Ray and to at least 3 other men in their company, that he understood the system, that he'd worked with the VA on his own claim, that the forms weren't as bad as they looked if you knew what to fill in where. He had been that kind of man, organized, useful, the one who remembered whose birthday it was and whose wife was sick and who had a truck with a trailer hitch when someone needed to move a couch. Norris had always liked Dean for those qualities, had trusted him for those qualities. Ray waited for benefits that never came. Dean told him the claim was processing, told him these things took time. Ray started drinking to get to sleep. He lost the lumberyard job. Marion left in '79 and took Connie to her mother's house in Warrenton. Ray kept waiting. In 1982, Ray drove his Ford pickup to a logging road near Saddle Mountain and did not come back. Connie had been 20 years old. She had spent 40 years believing her father was too proud to accept help from the government that had broken him. That was the story everyone told. Norris had told himself that story too. It was easier than the other one. He picked up the dog tag, turned it in his fingers. The tarnish was wearing off in spots where his skin had touched it, the dull silver black giving way to something brighter underneath. Dean had kept it. That was the detail Norris kept returning to. Not just the documents. A man might keep documents for any number of reasons, self-protection among them, the paranoid instinct to hold on to evidence that could cut both ways. But the dog tag served no purpose. It was not evidence that protected Dean. It did not document a payment or an account number. It was Ray's tag. And Dean had kept it in the bag with the paperwork, all those years, in the hollow of an oak on a ridge he walked sometimes in deer season. Like a man who puts a thing where he can find it, but not where he has to look at it every day. Norris wrapped the tag back in the burlap and put it in his jacket pocket. He gathered the documents carefully, the way he handled any evidence of a thing that couldn't be undone. He put them back in the folder, and the folder back in the saddlebag, and the bag on the floor behind the passenger seat with his field jacket laid over it. Then he sat looking at the bay for another 10 minutes. The crabbing boat had disappeared around the point. The water was the same color as the sky, and you couldn't tell where one ended and the other started. He had known Dean Suttles for 45 years. Dean was Carol's godfather. He came to Thanksgiving. He came to Christmas. He had wept at Marion Poole's funeral 14 years ago, standing next to Norris in the second row. Norris started the Chevy and pulled out onto the county road heading south toward home. His hands were steady on the wheel. His jaw was set. The sandwich sat untouched on the seat beside him. He spent 2 days doing nothing. This was not inaction. It was the most deliberate thing he knew how to do, the same way he held still in a deer stand before a shot, letting everything settle down to its true position. He sat on the back porch in the mornings with his coffee and looked at the Coast Range and turned the dog tag over in his fingers until the tarnish wore off in spots and the metal underneath showed through, bright and new-looking as the day it was stamped. Helen knew something was wrong. She didn't ask. They had been married 37 years, and she had learned the difference between a man who needed to be asked and a man who needed time. And she had the patience to wait. On the second morning, she put a second cup on the porch rail beside his without a word and went back inside. And that was the warmest thing anyone had done for him in a week. On the third morning, he drove to Portland. The VA regional office was on a street downtown between a sandwich shop and a parking garage, and the building looked like what it was, a federal office built in the 70s when someone important had decided that function was sufficient and that the people who needed help could walk up a ramp and take a number and wait. He found a parking spot 2 blocks over and walked. It was raining, which in Portland in the fall was the default condition of the world. The intake officer was a young woman named Monica, according to her nameplate. Mid-20s, brown hair pulled back, a small gold stud in her left ear that caught the fluorescent light. She had the careful, blank expression of someone who had been trained to listen to a wide variety of problems without reacting to any of them specifically. She listened to Norris describe the saddlebag and the documents. She wrote things down. When he was done, she asked him if he had the originals. "Copies," he said. "I kept the originals." She nodded as if this was either exactly right or exactly wrong, and her expression gave no indication of which. He handed her the photocopies he had made that morning at the FedEx store near his house. She looked through them. She wrote a case number in the top right corner of a form and handed him the carbon copy. "A VA investigator will be in contact," she said. "These matters from this era can take time. The records from 1975 through 1984 may not be fully digitized." "How much time?" he said. "I can't give you a specific timeline. These are complex historical cases." He held the carbon copy in his hands and looked at it. Monica had already moved her attention to the next form in her stack, not rudely, just finished with this item and moving to the next, the way a processor processes. He folded his copy and put it in his jacket pocket, next to where the dog tag sat in its piece of burlap. "There's a man's daughter," he said. "She's 60 years old. She's been blaming herself for her father's death for 40 years. I'd like her to know before she's 61. Monica looked up. For just a moment her professional expression slipped and something real moved across her face. Recognition, or something close to it. "I understand," she said. "I'll note the urgency in the case file." He thanked her and walked back out into the rain. On the drive home through the Coast Range, the rain turned to drizzle and then to nothing, and the highway came out through the trees above the Nehalem Valley in a shaft of late afternoon light that turned everything gold for about 5 minutes before the clouds closed back in. He stopped at a rest stop near Vernonia and used the payphone to call the VFW post in Astoria. Virgil Hess picked up on the third ring. Virgil was 70, the post commander, and he had a voice like gravel in a coffee can from 40 years of cigarettes he had quit 15 years ago. He had been with the 2nd Battalion, not Charlie Company, but he and Norris had known each other since the reunion started up in the early 80s, and he ran the post with the unhurried authority of a man who had decided a long time ago what he thought about most things. "Second Saturday," Virgil said, when Norris asked about the reunion schedule. 3 weeks out, same as always, November 2nd Saturday. He paused. "Dean's already confirmed. Brought the bourbon last time, said he'd bring it again. You coming this year?" "I'll be there," Norris said. He hung up and stood in the rest stop parking lot for a minute, with his hand on the phone. A family in a minivan was parked 2 spaces over, kids pressed against the window glass, father walking a dog in circles on the grass median. Normal afternoon, normal life. That evening, Dean's GMC Sierra pulled into Norris's gravel drive at 6:15. Norris saw the headlights from the kitchen window, and his hands went still over the sink where he was rinsing a coffee cup. Dean's truck. He knew it by the sound of the engine, a particular knock in the left cylinder that Dean had been meaning to get looked at for 2 years. Dean stepped out carrying a 6-pack of Rainier, the way he had done 1,000 times. He was thick-bodied, white-haired, his face creased from decades of coastal weather and an outdoor life. He wore his Vietnam veteran's cap, the dark navy blue one with the gold lettering that he wore to reunions and also apparently to casual visits on Tuesday evenings. He looked the way he always looked, a decent man, a good neighbor, a man you would trust with the things that mattered. Norris dried his hands on the dish towel and went to the door. "Heard you were up on Wickiup Ridge last week," Dean said easily, handing over 2 cans and settling into the porch chair on the left. His chair, the one with the better view of the drive. "Final cruise before retirement. How's it looking up there?" "Fair," Norris said. "Good timber in the upper stand. Some blowdown blocking the skidder route on the south draw." He sat down in the other chair and opened his beer. "You been up that way lately?" Dean shook his head. "Not since deer season last year. The road's too muddy past October for my knees." He tilted his can back and drank. "Find anything interesting? Sometimes those old parcels have surprises. Saw a marten up there once, couple years back. Big one." Norris had the dog tag in his jacket pocket on the hook by the door. He could feel its specific gravity from here, a small weight that was larger than its size. "Just timber," he said. "Well?" Dean stretched his legs out. "Last contract, big moment." Something like that. They drank their beers in the early dark, and the fog rolled in off the coast the way it always did in November, filling the lower ground first, softening the tree line. Dean told a story about their old sergeant that Norris had heard 3 times before. Norris laughed at the right moments. Dean laughed at his own punchline. The beer was cold and the porch was dry and the fog kept coming. After Dean left, his taillights fading down the gravel drive into the dark, Norris stood on the porch for a long time. He did not go back inside right away. He listened to the GMC's engine sound diminish to nothing, and then he listened to the fog and the trees and the creek down in the ravine. 45 years, that was the length of it. 45 years of holidays and beer on the porch and a man's voice you knew as well as your own. 45 years of something living inside it that you hadn't known was there, quiet and patient as rot inside a standing tree, invisible until you put a blade to it and cut it open, and the smell hit you, and you understood what had been there all along. The fog was all the way up to the porch rail now. He went inside and locked the door. A week before the reunion, Norris drove to Warrenton to see Connie Poole. He had been thinking about the visit for days, turning it over the way you turn over a difficult timber call. The angles of it, the approach, what you say and what you hold back. He had not seen Ray's daughter in 3 years, not since a Memorial Day ceremony at the County Veterans Monument in Astoria, where she had laid a small bunch of carnations at the base of the granite, and then stood with her hands clasped in front of her for a minute, not speaking to anyone, then turned and walked back to her car. He had watched her go from across the plaza and thought about calling her name, and then not done it. The county library in Warrenton was a low brick building on the main street, flanked by a dentist's office on one side and a hardware store on the other. He parked the Chevy in the small lot out front and sat in the cab for a moment. The dashboard clock said 11:15. He got out. The library smelled of paper and industrial carpet cleaner and that particular quiet that only libraries and churches share. The kind that is not really silence, but the controlled absence of noise. A young man at the front desk, maybe 22, looked up from a catalog cart with a polite expression. He had a small stud earring that caught the overhead light. "I'm looking for Connie Poole," Norris said. "Back in the stacks," the young man said, pointing left. He found her in the 700s, shelving returns from a cart. She was 60 now, thin the way her father had been thin. Not slight, but economical, as if she'd burned down to the essential parts. She had Ray's jaw, that same sharp line, and Ray's eyes, which had always reminded Norris of a dog that had learned not to expect much from people and had made its peace with that. She looked up when she heard his boots on the linoleum and went still for just a moment, the kind of still that happens when memory arrives before recognition does. "Mr. Langford." She placed the book she was holding back in the cart, spine out. Her reading glasses were perched on her head, the left earpiece repaired with a twist of electrical tape that she hadn't bothered to replace. "It's been a long time." "It has," he said. "I'm sorry for showing up without calling." "It's all right." She pulled her glasses down and looked at him over the rims for a moment, the way librarians look at you when they are deciding what kind of question you are actually asking. "You want to sit down? We have a break room." The break room was a narrow space with a folding table and 4 plastic chairs and a drip coffee maker that had been running since approximately the Nixon administration. She poured 2 cups into foam cups without asking if he wanted any. His was too dark and a little bitter, and exactly right for the conversation he was about to have. Or rather, the conversation he was about to not quite have. He asked about her father the way you approach a conch on a tree trunk, from the side, not straight on. He asked if she remembered much about Ray's time after the war. She settled into her chair and wrapped her hands around her foam cup, and talked the way people talk when they have been carrying something a long time, and someone finally asks about it directly, which almost no one ever does. She said Ray had been different when he came back. Not violent, not the way some of the men came back, but absent. Present in the room and absent from it at the same time. The way a window is present, but you see through it rather than at it. She said he had good months, especially in the summers, when he could be outdoors most of the day, and the long light seemed to settle something in him. She said in the winters he would sit in the kitchen with the lights off, and she and her mother would eat dinner with him in the dark, because it seemed rude to turn the lights on. He never talked about the VA stuff, she said, not directly. Mom said he'd applied for disability, that Dean Suttles was handling the paperwork. And then nothing happened. For years nothing happened. Dad said the government had forgotten about them. He was angry about it, but he was always angry in those years, so it was hard to separate out what was specifically about the money from just everything. Norris put his cup down. What did he think had happened to the claim? Connie shook her head. He thought it got lost. That's what he always said. That the paperwork got lost in the system. He stopped asking Dean about it eventually, I think because it was too humiliating to keep asking and hearing that it was processing. He didn't blame Dean. He blamed the VA, the government, the whole apparatus. She paused. Mom told me later that she thought he'd given up. Not on the claim specifically, just on the idea that anything was going to come through for him. That he'd decided he wasn't worth the follow-up. She looked at her cup. 14 years of her mother's voice in that sentence, and she felt it in the way her jaw tightened. I always thought, she said slowly, that if he'd had the money, things might have been different. Not certainly, but possibly. He could have gotten proper help for the sleep problems. He could have seen a therapist. He could have had some margin, you know, some room to work with. Instead, he was just borrowing against nothing every month until there was nothing left to borrow against. She looked up at Norris then, and something in her expression shifted. a cautious, almost involuntary widening of the eyes that asked a question without forming it. He did not answer the question, not yet. He thanked her for the coffee and told her he had some things to sort out and that he would be in touch. He said this carefully, with the weight of a promise rather than a pleasantry. She recognized the difference. She walked him back through the stacks to the door and stopped in the afternoon light of the entrance with one hand on the doorframe, her glasses back up on her head. "Mr. Langford," she said, "is there something you know?" "I'm working on knowing it," he said. It was as honest an answer as he could give. He drove home through rain so heavy his wipers couldn't keep up, the coast fog and the inland rain arriving together the way they did in November, and the world outside the windshield reduced to moving gray. He called the VA investigator from the kitchen that evening. Special Agent Torres had a careful voice, a voice trained to deliver news without inflection. The news was that the federal statute of limitations on benefits fraud was 5 years from the date of discovery or last act of fraud. The claims were from the 1970s. The statute had expired before Norris was old enough to find the bag. Criminal prosecution was essentially impossible. The VA Inspector General could make a referral. Administrative proceedings might be possible. Asset recovery could be pursued if there were assets to recover. But no handcuffs. No courtroom, no sentence. He thanked Torres and sat in the dark kitchen with the phone in his lap. The refrigerator hummed. Outside, the rain beat on the gutters that needed cleaning. He had known, somewhere in the back of his mind, that the law would not give him what he wanted, because the law measured time in a different unit than human lives did, and some crimes were simply too old for it to see clearly. But there was still one room where everyone who needed to hear the truth would be present. One room he knew how to enter. 6 days. 4 days before the reunion, Norris was splitting wood behind the house when he heard Dean's GMC on the gravel. He set the maul down against the splitting block and waited. Dean came around the corner of the house without calling out, which he had never done before. He always called out, "Norris," or "Hey," or something. This time, he just appeared at the corner of the house and stood there. And even from 30 feet, Norris could see that the ease was gone from his posture. Dean was 72, and it showed in his hips and shoulders in the ordinary way. But what showed today was something additional, a tensing through the upper back, and the way his hands were in his jacket pockets rather than hanging loose at his sides. He looked like a man who had been thinking hard about something for days, and had finally decided to stop thinking and do. "Need to talk to you," he said. "All right," Norris said. They went inside. Norris washed the wood chips off his hands at the kitchen sink, while Dean stood in the middle of the living room and looked at the walls. The mounted elk antlers above the fireplace. The framed photographs on the mantel and the shelf above it. Helen at their wedding, Carol as a baby. A shot of the Coast Range in October from up on the Saddle Mountain Trail. And the platoon photograph, the one from '69, 23 young men in fatigues standing in front of a Huey at some firebase whose name Norris could no longer recall. Ray was in the back row, grinning his narrow grin, his arm around Dean's shoulder. "Somebody at the post mentioned you went to the VA office in Portland," Dean said. He was not looking at Norris. He was looking at the photograph. Norris dried his hands on the kitchen towel. "Word gets around." "It does in a small county." Dean turned from the photograph. His face was the color of old concrete, gray, without variation. "You and I go back 45 years, Norris. I was best man at your wedding. I held your daughter the day she was born." He sat down on the edge of the couch without being invited to, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. "I'm asking you, man to man, as someone who has been your friend every day for 45 years, whatever you found on that ridge, let it stay where it was." The room was quiet. The refrigerator hummed from the kitchen. Outside the window, a Clark's nutcracker was working on something in the yard. Norris leaned against the door frame. "You kept his tag," he said. Dean went completely still. "Ray's tag was in the bag. Everything else in there you could maybe explain. Documents from 40 years ago, Financial records, paperwork. Men keep things they shouldn't. I understand that. But Ray's dog tag. Norris kept his voice level and unhurried, the way he kept his voice level when he was reading a tree that was going to need to come down. A dead man's tag, Dean. Why did you keep it? Dean's hands were flat on his knees. He looked at them. Because I owed him that much, he said. I owed him something. His voice had dropped and roughened, and the something in it was not quite remorse and not quite grief and was, Norris thought, the specific sound of a man who has lived with a wrong thing so long that the wrong thing has become the shape of his conscience, and he has confused the two. You owed him his money, Norris said. You owed him his benefits. You owed Ray Poole his life. Dean stood up. His face had gone from gray to something worse. Not flushed, but contracted, the muscles pulling inward the way a man's face does when he has absorbed something he did not expect to hurt as much as it hurts. He walked toward the door, and Norris stepped aside to let him pass. At the door, his hand on the frame, Dean turned back. If you do this, he said, you'll lose everything. Every friend you have in this county wears the same cap I'm wearing. They've known me for 40 years. They've known Dean Suttles, the man who organized these reunions, who sent the birthday cards, who brought the bourbon and stayed to clean up. They don't want to look at this. They won't thank you for making them look. They'll hate you for it. It was the type-defining line. The line that told you exactly who you were dealing with and had always been dealing with underneath the beer on the porch and the birthday cards and the 45 years of easy friendship. A man who understood the situation perfectly and had decided the relevant question was not what was right, but what people would choose not to look at. Norris went to the side table by the couch. The drawer had a key for the gun safe, a tube of lip balm, a small pocket flashlight, and the burlap-wrapped dog tag, which he had moved there from his jacket pocket that morning, because carrying it felt like something he should stop doing. He unwrapped it and held it up so Dean could see it across the room. The metal caught the lamplight. I'm not doing it for them, he said. Dean looked at the tag for a long moment. He did not say anything else. He turned and went out the door without closing it behind him, and the November cold poured in across the threshold and filled the living room, and Norris stood there holding the tag in his hand while the GMC's engine turned over in the drive and the headlights swept across the front window and the truck backed out and the sound of it diminished down the gravel road. He went to the door and closed it. He stood in the quiet house and let the cold settle. He thought about Connie in the library, her hands around her foam cup, saying, he decided he wasn't worth the follow-up. He thought about Ray in a Ford pickup on a logging road near Saddle Mountain, the engine running. He thought about 45 years of Thanksgivings and Christmas mornings and second Saturdays at the VFW Hall, all of it ordinary and warm and real, in the way that friendship between old men who have been through the same bad years is real, and underneath all of it, quiet as groundwater, the thing that had been there all along. 4 days. He rewrapped the tag in the burlap and put it in his coat pocket. Helen came into the living room from the kitchen. She looked at his face and then looked at the door and then back at him. She didn't ask. She had heard the truck arrive and leave, had heard Dean's voice through the walls without being able to make out the words. She was 61 years old, and she had known Norris Langford for 38 of them, and she read him the way he read timber. Not by the individual marks, but by the overall shape of the thing. She went back to the kitchen. 2 minutes later, she came out with a cup of coffee and set it on the side table next to the drawer where the dog tag was. She gave his arm one firm squeeze as she passed, the kind that said she was with him and wasn't going to say it with more words than that, and went back to what she had been doing. The VFW Hall in Astoria sat on a bluff above the Columbia River bar, where the river met the Pacific and the water was never still. The building was post and beam, put up in the early 60s by members who had done the work themselves on weekends. The floor not quite level, the windows not quite square in their frames. The whole structure carrying the personality of the men who built it rather than any architect's intentions. American flags hung from the ceiling beams. A banner read, "Welcome home, Charlie Company, second Saturday." Norris arrived at 6:15, a few minutes after most of the others. The parking lot held 3 trucks and a Jeep Cherokee, and he recognized every one of them. He sat in the Chevy for a minute with the engine off. The saddlebag was on the passenger side floor. He had transferred the documents back into it that morning, the originals, not the copies, including the bank statements and all 7 claim forms. The dog tag was in his shirt pocket. He went in. The hall was warm from the kerosene heater in the corner that Virgil Hess had been fussing with for 15 years without ever quite getting it right. 2 degrees too warm, same as always. 17 men sat at the folding tables arranged in a square, and 8 family members, including Merle Danforth's granddaughter who was 9 and sat beside her grandfather coloring in a spiral notebook. Potluck spread across the table, a crock of beans, cornbread, sliced roast beef under plastic wrap, coffee urns, a bottle of bourbon making its slow circuit. Dean Suttles was at the head of the table where he always sat. He was talking to Carl Jessup, who was laughing at something, and the laugh stopped when Norris walked in, because Norris walked in carrying the saddlebag, and his face was what it was. Dean saw him. The laugh that was stopping around Carl Jessup went the rest of the way around the table in about 4 seconds, the way silence spreads in a room when someone enters it carrying the particular kind of weight that Norris was carrying. Virgil Hess stood up from his chair at the near end. He was a big man with white hair cut short and the thick neck of someone who had worked outdoors all his life. He had a coffee cup in one hand. "Norris, good to have you. Grab a plate." Norris did not grab a plate. He walked to the center of the square of tables, which meant walking along the inner edge of the setup, and he set the saddlebag down on the table in the middle, where the potluck would have gone if someone had gotten around to moving it. The leather hit the wood with a sound that carried in the room. Everyone looked at it. "I found this on Wickiup Ridge 2.5 weeks ago," he said. The room was quiet enough that he didn't need to raise his voice. Inside the hollow of an old oak near the top of the ridge. The tree is marked for cutting next week. 7 more days and this saddlebag would have gone through a chipper, and nobody in this room would ever have known it existed. He opened the bag. He pulled out the folder. He laid the claim forms out one by one on the table, reading each name aloud as he placed it. Harlan Pratt, Carl Jessup, Merle Danforth, Raymond Poole, Billy Voss, Donald Kern, Lawrence Fitch. The names belonged to men present and men not present. Harlan Pratt was across the table, his thick hands flat on the tabletop. Carl Jessup sat very still beside Dean. Merle Danforth's granddaughter looked up from her coloring book with the frank curiosity of a 9-year-old who doesn't yet know when not to look. Billy Voss had died in 2012. Donald Kern was in a nursing home. Lawrence Fitch was buried on the hill above town. Norris laid out the bank statements. "These deposits correspond to the VA disability amounts for the injuries claimed on these forms," he said. 8 years of deposits, 1 account. 45 years in this bag. He reached into his shirt pocket and took out the dog tag. He held it for a moment in his palm, the tarnish worn away in places from the weeks he'd been handling it, the metal showing through in bright patches. He walked to the head of the table and set it down directly in front of Dean Suttles. "Ray Poole's tag," he said, "at the bottom of the bag, underneath everything else." The room was the kind of quiet that is not empty but full of breathing and the tick of the wall clock and the kerosene heaters cycling, and underneath all of that, 17 men not making a sound, which is a different kind of quiet from the room simply being empty. Dean looked at the dog tag. His hands were flat on the table. The bourbon bottle was at his elbow, untouched. His face was composed in a way that Norris recognized, not the composure of innocence, but the composure of a man who has been expecting a knock at the door for a long time and has had 40 years to decide how to look when it finally comes. He did not look surprised. He did not look defiant. He looked like what he was, a man at the end of something. "Norris," he said. Just the name, nothing before it and nothing after it. A name said the way a period ends a sentence, not a question, not an appeal, just a point where the speaking stopped. The clock ticked, the heater cycled. The river pushed against the bar out past the bluff. Then Merle Danforth, 69, who had worked the same waterfront crane job for 31 years before his back gave out, who wore his good flannel shirt to these dinners and always brought the beans, picked up the claim form with his name on it. He read it. His jaw worked once, the way a jaw works when a man is deciding whether to say something and then deciding not to. He set the form back on the table. He pushed his chair back. He stood up and walked to the door and opened it and went out. And the November wind came in briefly and went back out with him when the door swung closed. Then Carl Jessup. Then Harlan Pratt, who paused at the doorframe and looked back at Dean with an expression that was not anger and not grief, but the look of a man measuring a distance he hadn't known existed. Billy Voss's widow, a small woman named Paulette, who drove from Ilwaco every second Saturday, picked up her purse and walked out without looking at Dean. Ray Poole's cousin from Seaside stood up and put on his jacket and left without a word. Merle's granddaughter closed her coloring book and held her grandfather's hand as he came back in and took her out with him, her little boots tapping on the floor. The door opened and closed, each time the river wind moved through the room. Within 6 minutes, Dean Suttles sat alone at a table set for 25. The potluck food was going cold. The bourbon bottle had not moved. The banner above him read, "Welcome Home." Norris was the last one standing inside. He picked up Ray's dog tag from the table in front of Dean. Dean did not move, did not look up. Norris walked to the door and paused. The night air was cold against his face through the gap he'd made with his shoulder. Dean was sitting with his hands flat on the table, staring at the place where the tag had been. He was motionless in the way that a large thing is motionless. Not still by choice, but because the thing that moves it has finally run out. Norris went out and pulled the door closed behind him. The river was black and moving far below the bluff. The night smelled of salt water and fir resin and the last of the evening's rain on the parking lot gravel. The others were standing in small groups by their vehicles, talking quietly or not talking. Nobody looked at him as he walked to the Chevy and got in and drove home. The aftermath moved through the veterans community the way news moves through a small county. Not fast, not loud, but completely. Within 4 days, every man who had worn a Charlie Company patch in Clatsop County knew what Dean Suttles had done. Within 2 weeks, people who had never met Dean were nodding about it over coffee in the coast town diners and the tackle shops along the Astoria waterfront. Norris heard this the way you hear rain on a metal roof. He had delivered the originals to Special Agent Torres the morning after the reunion, driving to Portland in the gray November dawn. Torres met him in the lobby and took the documents with the careful handling of someone who understood their weight. She said the Inspector General's office would open a formal inquiry. He said he understood about time. The VA Inspector General's inquiry moved at the government pace, not fast by any human measurement, but more certain than it looks. By January, the case was formally open. By March, the investigators had interviewed 11 people, including Norris twice and Dean once. Dean appeared with a lawyer and did not dispute the documents. Criminal prosecution remained unavailable. The statute had run out. What remained was the administrative track, a finding by the VA's Administrative Law Court that benefits had been fraudulently obtained and an order requiring repayment. Slower and quieter and less satisfying to anyone who wanted handcuffs, which Norris understood was not the point. In April, the VA contacted the families of all 7 veterans whose claims had been forged. 3 of the 7 men were still alive: Harlan Pratt, Merle Danforth, and Donald Kern, who was in the nursing home but was still cogent enough to listen and to say, when the investigator finished reading the summary, "I always thought something was wrong." For each of the 3 surviving veterans, the VA opened a new legitimate disability review and agreed to expedited processing with back payment consideration. For the 4 who were dead, Raymond Poole, Billy Voss, Lawrence Fitch, and Carl Jessup, who died of a heart attack in February, 3 months after the reunion. The VA initiated survivor benefit proceedings. Restitution would reach the families. Connie Poole received her letter on a Thursday morning in May. Her neighbor, B., who wore orthopedic shoes and kept an eye on the house, called her at the library desk to say a government envelope had come that looked like it needed opening. Connie drove home on her lunch break. She called Norris from the library parking lot, crying hard enough that it took him a moment to understand who it was. The check was for back benefits owed to the estate of Raymond J. Poole. The letter acknowledged that the disability claim bearing his name had been fraudulently filed by a third party, and compensation had never reached the intended recipient. He wasn't too proud, she said. The words came in pieces. He wasn't too proud. He just never got it. He waited, and it never came, and he thought the government decided he wasn't worth it. I know, Norris said. He just never got it, she said again, and Norris let that repeat because it needed to. The sentence that had been wrong for 40 years finally said right. Dean Suttles did not fight the proceedings. His lawyer negotiated a consent order. Full restitution, $241,230, to be paid from his assets. His 10-acre parcel outside Astoria was listed at auction. Norris drove past the for sale sign once, coming back from a consultancy in Cannon Beach. He did not slow down. The GMC Sierra went at a bank sale. His savings were levied. He moved into a single room at a boarding house in Seaside run by a woman named Mrs. Halverson, who asked few questions. The VFW post voted on Dean's membership at the October meeting. Show of hands. Motion to revoke. Every hand went up. Virgil Hess wrote the result in the minutes book in his careful hand and moved to the next item on the agenda. Norris did not attend. He heard about it from Virgil, who called that evening and said, "It's done." They talked for a few minutes about a road condition south of Seaside and then hung up. Norris sat in the kitchen where the light was on, and Helen was in the next room with the sound of pages turning. His daughter Carol called that week. She had heard from her mother. Carol was 36, a school teacher in Tillamook, and she had grown up calling Dean Suttles her uncle. "He was my godfather," she said. "I know," Norris said. "I'm sorry." "Don't be sorry," she said. "You did right." A pause. "It's just hard. You think you know someone your whole life, and then find out something was underneath." "Yes," Norris said. The company reunions continued. The second Saturday of every month at the VFW Hall. The potluck, the coffee, the bourbon making its circuit. Dean's chair at the head of the table stayed empty. No one removed it. No one sat in it. It stood there month after month, not a memorial to Dean, but to what they had all believed about him for 40 years. A different kind of loss, and in some ways, a harder one. Epilogue. The VA administrative law judge issued her ruling from the regional office in Portland on a gray Wednesday in November, 1 year and 2 weeks after Norris Langford first reached his arm into the hollow of a 300-year-old oak on a ridge in Clatsop County. The ruling found that Dean Everett Suttles had knowingly and fraudulently obtained disability benefits intended for 7 veterans of Charlie Company between 1975 and 1984. Total amount fraudulently obtained, $241,230. Full restitution ordered. The administrative record to reflect the finding permanently. The judge added one sentence at the close of the ruling that the court reporter read back twice to ensure the transcript was correct. The men whose names appear on these claims earned their benefits in combat. The respondent earned nothing but their trust, and he spent that too. Connie Poole used the back benefit funds to establish the Raymond J. Poole Memorial Fund at the Clatsop County Veterans Service Office. The fund provides emergency assistance to veterans struggling with benefits claims, transportation to VA appointments, Help filing forms. Someone to sit with you when the system feels impossible to navigate alone. She volunteers there every Saturday morning. The first veteran she helped was a 26-year-old Marine back from Afghanistan who could not get his hearing loss claim processed despite 3 previous attempts. She drove him to Portland in her old Chevy and sat with him for 4 hours while the paperwork went through. On the drive home through the Coast Range, he asked her why she did it. She looked at the road for a moment before answering. "My father needed someone to sit with him," she said. Nobody did. On a Sunday morning in December, Norris drove the Chevy to the Veterans Cemetery on the hill above Astoria. The grass was wet. The headstones stood in rows as straight as planted timber. He walked the rows until he found the marker. Poole, Raymond J., Private First Class, United States Army, 1947 to 1982. He knelt. He placed the dog tag on the granite. The broken chain coiled on the stone like a question mark that had finally found its answer. He did not speak. He stood, and he turned, and he walked back down the hill toward his truck, his boots leaving dark prints in the wet grass. Behind him, the tag rested on the stone. The fog moved in off the river. The headstones disappeared into the gray, row by row, until nothing was left but the sound of the fog and the wet grass, and somewhere below the bluff, the river moving toward the bar where it always met the sea.